The hospital was a place of constant movement. Ambulances rushed in at all hours, doctors and nurses walked briskly through the hallways, and patients came and went. But among all the usual activity, something unusual had begun to happen. Every night, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a small bear appeared outside the hospital entrance. At first, it seemed like an odd coincidence, an animal that had wandered too far from the forest. But when the bear kept returning night after night, people started paying attention. The hospital staff didn't know what to make of it. Some assumed the animal was lost, while others worried it might pose a danger. Security guards attempted to chase it away by clapping their hands and making loud noises, but the bear never reacted aggressively. It would simply take a few steps back, sit down, and watch from a distance. And when the guards went back inside, the bear would quietly return to the same spot near the entrance. The pattern continued without fail. No matter how many times it was shooed away, it always came back. The bear didn't approach people. It didn't growl or make any effort to enter the hospital. It simply curled up on the cold ground, tucking its small body into a tight ball, as if trying to protect itself from the night's chill. Even when the winter winds grew stronger, the bear never left. Word spread quickly among the hospital staff, and soon nearly everyone knew about the strange visitor. Some saw it as a nuisance, something that should be dealt with before it caused problems. Others, however, felt differently. A few nurses took pity on the lonely creature and began leaving food for it. At first, they did so in secret, worried they might get in trouble for feeding a wild animal. But when they saw how quietly and gratefully the bear accepted the food, their concern faded. One night, a young nurse stepped out during her break, carrying a small tray with leftover food from the hospital cafeteria. She placed it a few feet away from the bear and took a step back. The bear lifted its head, looking at her with cautious eyes. After a moment, it slowly crawled toward the tray, sniffed the food, and carefully began to eat. The nurse watched in silence, feeling a strange sense of sadness settle in her chest. This was not the behavior of a wild bear looking for trouble. It was something else, something she couldn't quite understand. As the days passed, more staff members began to notice the bear's routine. It arrived shortly after sunset, settled in for the night, and left just before sunrise. No one knew where it went during the day, but it always returned. Some started calling it the hospital's silent guardian. Others made jokes about it being the most loyal patient they had ever seen. But beneath the humor, there was a lingering sense of curiosity. Why did the bear keep coming back? What was it waiting for? These questions remained unanswered, but one thing was certain. The little bear wasn't just lost or wandering aimlessly. It had a purpose, even if no one understood it yet. And as the days turned into weeks, that purpose would soon begin to reveal itself in a way no one could have imagined. Dr. Elias had always been a man of reason. He spent his days moving from one patient to the next, diagnosing illnesses, prescribing treatments, and making difficult decisions. But the presence of the little bear outside the hospital stirred something unusual in him. He had noticed the animal several times, curled up near the entrance, its small body shivering in the cold night air. While most of the hospital staff had either ignored it or grown used to its presence, he found himself unable to look away. One evening, as he left the hospital after a long shift, he saw the bear again. It was lying in its usual spot, eyes half closed but still alert. Dr. Elias paused, watching the bear for a moment longer than usual. It looked exhausted, as if it hadn't properly rested in days. There was no aggression in its posture, no sign of fear. It was simply there, waiting for something. The doctor's curiosity deepened when he noticed a pattern. The bear didn't just sleep anywhere outside the hospital. It always positioned itself near the main entrance, specifically in view of one of the large glass windows that overlooked the reception area. On some nights, the bear would lift its head and stare inside, as if searching for something beyond the walls. It wasn't looking for food or shelter. It was looking for someone. Dr. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. When he mentioned the bear to a few nurses, they nodded, confirming they had seen it too. Some had tried to feed it, while others had simply accepted its presence as part of their daily routine. But no one had an answer as to why it was there. One of the security guards, an older man named Gavin, approached him later that night. He had worked at the hospital for years and had seen his fair share of strange things, but even he admitted that this was different. He told Dr. Elias that the bear had been there every night without fail. It never approached people, never made a mess, and never caused trouble. It simply waited. Something about the way Gavin said the word waited made the doctor's stomach tighten. What was the bear waiting for? The next morning, before starting his rounds, Dr. Elias decided to dig a little deeper. He spoke to some of the nurses who had been on duty when the bear first appeared. One of them mentioned something that made his pulse quicken. A few days before the bear had started sleeping outside, an ambulance had arrived from a remote area near the forest. The patient had been a young girl, unconscious and in critical condition. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Dr. Elias pulled up the hospital records, scanning through the recent admissions until he found what he was looking for. The girl's name was Nova. She had been brought in after an accident, found alone near the forest. The details of the report mentioned something that made the doctor's breath catch. When the rescue team had found the girl, she hadn't been alone. There had been a small bear near her, watching over her as the paramedics worked to stabilize her. The rescuers had assumed it was just a coincidence, a wild animal that happened to be nearby. But now, with the bear sleeping outside the hospital every night, Dr. Elias was no longer sure. Could it be possible that the bear had followed her all the way here? Could it be waiting for her to wake up? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He had seen many things in his years of medical practice, but this was something different, something that defied logic. That night, as he left the hospital again, he found himself walking toward the entrance instead of heading straight to his car. The bear was there, just as expected, curled up in the same spot. Dr. Elias stood still, watching it, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew he had to find out the truth, and he knew that whatever the answer was, it would change everything. Dr. Elias couldn't push the thought away. The connection between the little bear and the girl named Nova was becoming too strong to ignore. He had spent years following medical logic, relying on science and reason to guide his decisions, but this was something else. This wasn't just an animal looking for shelter. It wasn't just a coincidence. The bear was here for a reason. The next morning, before his rounds began, he made his way to the pediatric ward. He found Nova's name on the patient list and stepped into her room. The young girl was still unconscious, her small frame lying motionless on the hospital bed. Machines beeped softly, monitoring her condition. A nurse stood nearby, adjusting her for. Dr. Elias reviewed her medical file. Her injuries were severe but not fatal. The doctors expected her to wake up soon, but for now she remained in a deep sleep. The file provided little information about her background. There was no record of immediate family members. The only known fact was that she had been found near the forest after what seemed to be an accident. Something about the case gnawed at him. He decided to track down the paramedics who had brought her in. If the bear had truly been with her when she was found, there had to be more to the story. He eventually located one of the rescue workers, a man named Torin, who had been part of the emergency response that day. Torin remembered the case well. He described how they had found Nova lying near a dirt path in the woods, unconscious but breathing. What stood out to him was that she hadn't been alone. A small bear had been nearby, pacing nervously as the paramedics worked. At first, they thought it was just a wild animal, but then something strange happened. The bear hadn't run away. It had stayed close, watching them, as if making sure Nova was safe. They had no choice but to take the girl away quickly. The bear had followed them for a short distance but had eventually stopped when the ambulance doors closed. At the time, Torin had assumed it was the end of it. But now, with the bear outside the hospital every night, the truth was becoming clearer. Dr. Elias listened carefully, his suspicions confirmed. This wasn't just an ordinary bear. It had been with Nova before she was brought to the hospital, and now it was waiting for her. That evening, as he walked out of the hospital once more, he found himself standing by the entrance, staring at the small bear curled up in the same spot. It lifted its head slightly, its dark eyes filled with something that looked too much like longing. Dr. Elias felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent his life treating patients, studying the human body, learning the science of healing. But in that moment, he realized there were some things that couldn't be explained by medicine alone. The bear wasn't lost. It wasn't searching for food or shelter. It was waiting for its friend, and it wasn't going to leave until it saw her again. Dr. Elias could no longer ignore what was right in front of him. The little bear hadn't simply wandered to the hospital by accident. It had followed Nova. It had been there when she was found, and now it was waiting for her, night after night without fail. The realization weighed heavily on him as he stood at the entrance, staring at the small creature curled up on the cold pavement. The bear lifted its head slightly, blinking tiredly, as if exhaustion was finally catching up with it. Despite the food some of the nurses had left for it, the bear seemed weaker than before. It wasn't just physically tired. It was emotionally drained, waiting for something it didn't understand. Dr. Elias knew he had to act. He spent the next day gathering as much information as he could. He searched hospital records, trying to find any relatives or guardians listed under Nova's name. There were none, no parents, no immediate family. The only mention was of a grandfather who lived deep in the forest, miles away from any town. A sense of unease settled in his chest. If Nova had no family nearby, then how had she survived? Who had been taking care of her? He made a call to the authorities, requesting more details about the accident that had brought her to the hospital. The report was brief. Nova had been found lying near a narrow forest trail, unconscious, with no signs of foul play. She had minor fractures, deep scratches, and signs of exposure to the elements, but nothing that suggested an attack or deliberate harm. The most curious part of the report was a note written by the ranger who had assisted in her rescue. It stated that she had been found with a small bear cub nearby. The ranger had assumed it was wild. A coincidence, nothing more. But now Dr. Elias knew better. Nova hadn't been alone in the forest. The bear had been with her. The doctor sat in his office, staring at the report, his mind racing. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth. Nova and the bear knew each other. They had a bond, one strong enough that, even after being separated, the bear had refused to leave. A nurse knocked on his door, breaking his train of thought. She informed him that Nova had begun to show signs of waking up. Dr. Elias hurried to her room. When he arrived, the girl was still unconscious, but her fingers twitched slightly, and her breathing had changed. The machines monitoring her condition showed signs of improvement. It wouldn't be long now, but what would she wake up to? She had been taken from the only life she had known. The bear that had stayed by her side was now alone outside, waiting for a reunion it didn't even understand. Dr. Elias rubbed his forehead, the weight of the situation settling in. He had dedicated his life to saving people, but this was different. This was about more than just medicine. This was about love, about loyalty, and for the first time in his career, he felt utterly unprepared for what came next. The following morning, Dr. Elias made his way to Nova's room, his heart heavy with thoughts of the little bear still waiting outside. The moment he stepped in, he noticed a change. Nova was awake. Her pale blue eyes blinked slowly as she tried to take in her surroundings. The beeping of machines, the sterile white walls, the quiet hum of voices outside the door. It was all unfamiliar to her. The nurse beside her smiled gently, whispering words of reassurance. But Nova wasn't looking at the nurse. She was staring at the window, her small hands gripping the blanket tightly. Her breathing was shallow, her gaze distant. It was as if she was looking for something. Dr. Elias approached slowly, his voice calm and soothing. He introduced himself, but Nova barely reacted. She was awake, but she seemed lost. Not just in the hospital, but within herself. He sat beside her, watching her for a moment before speaking again. He asked if she remembered what had happened, if she knew how she had ended up in the hospital. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. The silence in the room felt heavier than any word she could have spoken. Then, just as he was about to move on, something changed. Nova's fingers twitched against the blanket, Her lips trembled as if she was trying to form a thought she couldn't quite express. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke a single word, "Bear." Dr. Elias felt his breath hitch. It wasn't a question, it wasn't a random word. It was a name, spoken with longing, with fear, with something deeper than a simple attachment. Nova's eyes finally met his, wide and desperate. Tears welled in them, her hands tightening into small fists. Her body, weak from days of unconsciousness, trembled with the effort of trying to speak again. But she didn't need to. The emotion in her face said everything. She was looking for her bear. Dr. Elias leaned forward, his voice softer now. He told her that a bear had been waiting outside the hospital every night. A small one, curled up near the entrance, never leaving, no matter how cold it got. He watched as Nova's breath caught in her throat, as her tears spilled over, running down her pale cheeks. That was all the confirmation he needed. Nova and the bear were more than just connected, they were family. He couldn't begin to imagine how their bond had formed. But the truth was clear. This wasn't an ordinary wild animal. This was a companion, a guardian, something deeper than anyone had realized. And it had stayed, waiting, hoping, never giving up. Nova tried to sit up, her body trembling with the effort. The nurse gently placed a hand on her shoulder, urging her to rest. But Nova shook her head. She didn't want rest. She wanted to see her bear. Dr. Elias had seen many patients wake up from unconsciousness. He had seen fear, confusion, even anger, but this was different. This was pure, overwhelming grief, the kind that only came from being separated from something or someone you loved more than anything in the world. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. That night, as the hospital grew quieter, Dr. Elias made his way to the entrance. The little bear was there, as always. It hadn't moved from its usual spot, its small body curled up against the cold ground. But tonight, something was different. The bear looked weaker. Its breaths were slower, its eyes heavy with exhaustion. It had waited for so long, through sleepless nights and endless days of uncertainty, and now it was beginning to break. Dr. Elias crouched down a few feet away, his voice barely above a whisper. He told the bear what he had told Nova, that she was awake, that she had been asking for it, that she hadn't forgotten. The bear didn't understand his words, but something in his tone made it lift its head. Its dark eyes, filled with sadness, locked onto his. And in that moment, the doctor knew what he had to do. He had to bring them back together, no matter the rules, no matter the risks. He would find a way because some bonds were too strong to be broken, and this was one of them. Dr. Elias had spent years making decisions that impacted people's lives. He had delivered difficult news to families, performed life-saving procedures, and witnessed miracles that defied all odds. But as he stood outside the hospital, looking at the small bear lying motionless near the entrance, he felt an ache in his chest unlike anything he had known before. The bear hadn't left, but it was growing weaker. Its small body trembled in the cold night air, its breaths coming slower than before. It had waited for days, holding on to something it didn't understand, believing that Nova would return to it. But how much longer could it hold on? Dr. Elias knew that hospital rules were strict. No wild animals were allowed anywhere near the building, let alone inside. But this wasn't just a wild animal. This was a living, breathing testament to loyalty, something purer than any bond he had ever seen. He walked back inside, his mind racing. If he couldn't bring the bear into the hospital, could he bring Nova to it? The thought alone sent a wave of uncertainty through him. She was still weak, barely able to sit up on her own. Moving her outside was risky. But the alternative was worse. If the bear continued to weaken, there was no telling what might happen. Would it stop waiting? Would it give up and leave, thinking Nova was never coming back? The thought alone was unbearable. The doctor made up his mind. That evening, after speaking privately with a few trusted nurses, he arranged for Nova to be moved to a wheelchair. She was still fragile, her arms and legs thin from days without movement. But the moment she heard she was being taken somewhere, she didn't protest. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. The nurse wheeled her through the quiet hospital halls, and Dr. Elias walked beside them, his heart pounding. He was breaking protocol, he knew that, but he also knew that some rules were meant to be broken. As they reached the entrance, the cool night air met them, brushing against Nova's pale skin, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't cold. She wasn't scared. She was looking for something, and then she saw it. The little bear, curled up in the same spot, barely moving. A sound escaped Nova's lips, a soft, broken gasp. Her fingers gripped the armrest of her wheelchair as tears welled up in her eyes. Dr. Elias watched as the bear stirred lightly, sensing something. It lifted its head slowly, as if waking from a dream, and when its eyes landed on Nova, everything changed. The moment stretched, frozen in time. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the bear scrambled to its feet. It stumbled forward, exhaustion evident in its movements, but nothing could stop it now. It let out a soft, broken cry, half a whimper, half a plea. Nova's entire body trembled as tears streamed down her face. She lifted her arms weakly, reaching out, unable to speak. The bear stopped just short of her wheelchair, its small frame shaking as it hesitated, as if afraid that this wasn't real, that maybe it was dreaming, that maybe she wasn't really there. Dr. Elias stepped back, his throat tightening. He had expected relief, perhaps even joy, but what he saw was something deeper, something raw. It was love. The bear pressed its forehead gently against Nova's outstretched hands, its breath warm against her skin. A sob escaped from her lips as her fingers curled into its fur, holding on as if she would never let go. The hospital door stood open behind them, the night stretching out into the unknown. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. The bear had waited, and now it had finally found what it was waiting for. Nova's fingers gripped the bear's fur as if she were afraid that at any moment it might disappear. Her body trembled with silent sobs, her small frame shaking with overwhelming relief. The little bear let out a soft sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, pressing closer to her, as if it too was afraid that this moment wasn't real. Dr. Elias stood back, watching the reunion with a tightness in his chest. He had spent years witnessing emotional moments, parents crying over newborns, families embracing their loved ones after long battles with illness, but nothing compared to this. This was something different, something pure. Nova buried her face in the bear's thick fur, her shoulders shaking as she wept. She was still weak, her body fragile from the days she had spent unconscious, but in this moment, she looked stronger than she had since she arrived at the hospital. The bear had given her something no medicine or treatment could hope. A few nurses had gathered near the entrance, watching the scene in silence. Some of them had fed the bear during its long wait outside, and now they wiped at their eyes, unable to contain their emotions. Nova lifted her head slowly, her tear-streaked face glowing under the dim hospital lights. She looked up at Dr. Elias, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. It took her a few tries, her voice barely above a whisper. But when the words came, they were filled with more emotion than any grand speech could have carried. "He waited for me." Dr. Elias swallowed hard. He nodded, unable to find the right words. The bear made a soft noise, nudging Nova's hand. Its dark eyes filled with something that looked so human it was almost painful to witness. It had never understood why Nova was taken away. It had only known that she was gone. But that hadn't stopped it from waiting, from believing. Nova stroked its fur with slow, trembling fingers, as if memorizing the feeling. She had spent her entire life with the bear, growing up beside it, sharing her days in the quiet solitude of the forest. They had played together, eaten together, even slept beside each other on cold nights. To anyone else, this was just an animal, but to Nova, it was family. Dr. Elias let out a slow breath. He had fought against his own instincts at first, struggling to reconcile the logic of science with the undeniable truth in front of him. But there were some things in life that couldn't be explained with reason or medical knowledge. Some bonds went beyond reason. The hospital staff watched in quiet reverence as Nova and the bear remained locked in their silent reunion. The bear had waited for this moment for so long, and now that it had finally come, it didn't move. It simply stayed, pressed against her, as if making sure she was really there. Dr. Elias knew they couldn't stay like this forever. The hospital was no place for a bear, and soon someone would step in to decide what should be done. But for now, no one spoke, no one interrupted, because at that moment, nothing else mattered. Nova was safe and the bear knew it. Dr. Elias stood silently, watching the moment unfold with a weight in his chest. He had spent years in medicine, but no textbook, no case study had ever prepared him for something like this. It wasn't just a simple reunion. It was something deeper, an unbreakable connection between two souls that had endured time, distance, and uncertainty. The hospital staff remained quiet, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the scene. Even those who had once questioned the bear's presence now understood. This wasn't just an animal. It was something far more profound, something that defied logic but couldn't be denied. Nova rested her forehead against the bear's soft fur. Her small body still weak but filled with a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. Dr. Elias knew that she had been healing, but this moment had done something no medicine could. It had given her a reason to fight. The reality of the situation, however, couldn't be ignored forever. The hospital wasn't a place for a bear, no matter how loyal or gentle it was. Sooner or later, someone would intervene, and a decision would have to be made. Dr. Elias turned to one of the senior nurses, speaking in a low voice. He needed to find a way to ensure the bear's safety. There had to be a solution, one that wouldn't separate them forever. The hospital administration was already aware of the situation, and while they had initially been concerned, even they couldn't ignore what was happening. A call was made to wildlife officials, not to remove the bear, but to find a way for it and Nova to stay connected. The response wasn't immediate, but Dr. Elias was determined. He wouldn't let this story end in heartbreak. As the night stretched on, the bear remained by Nova's side, pressing its warm body close to hers, as if afraid she would disappear again. Nova's hands never left its fur, her fingers gripping tightly, as if holding on to the only piece of home she had left. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone that love and loyalty weren't limited to humans. They existed in ways that defied explanation, in forms that no one could fully understand. Dr. Elias had witnessed many things in his life, but as he looked at the small bear curled protectively around Nova, he knew one thing for certain. Some bonds could never be broken, and this was one of them. The next morning, Dr. Elias met with the wildlife authorities who had arrived after hearing about the unusual case. Normally, a wild bear found near a hospital would be taken away without question. But this was different. The officials listened carefully as the doctor and hospital staff explained the story, their voices carrying the emotion of what they had witnessed. The bear had never been a threat. It had never acted out of fear or aggression. It had simply been waiting. After some discussion, a decision was made. Instead of removing the bear forcefully, arrangements would be made for it to be monitored and cared for in a protected area near the forest where it belonged. Nova, still recovering, would be allowed to visit, ensuring that their bond wouldn't be completely severed. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best way to keep them safe. Nova, though still weak, managed to smile when she was told. She had been afraid that, once again, she would lose the only family she had left, but knowing she would still get to see her bear filled her with a quiet relief. The officials, moved by the story, promised to take every measure to ensure the bear's safety. The hospital staff, who had grown used to seeing the small bear every night, gathered near the entrance as it was gently guided away. Nova sat in her wheelchair, watching as it walked toward the waiting vehicle, her heart aching at the thought of parting again. The bear turned one last time, locking eyes with her, as if memorizing her face. Then, with slow, reluctant steps, it climbed inside, ready for its journey back to the place it had always known as home. Days passed, and Nova's health improved. True to their word, the officials allowed her to visit the bear once she was strong enough. Each time she arrived, the bear's eyes would light up, its small body rushing forward to greet her. It wasn't the same as before, but it was enough. They had found a way to stay together, even if life had changed around them. Dr. Elias watched from a distance during one of her visits, his heart filled with a rare sense of fulfillment. He had spent years trying to heal people, but sometimes healing meant more than medicine. Sometimes it meant understanding that love and loyalty could come in many forms, even in the shape of a small bear who refused to give up. And so their story lived on, not just in the hospital where it had begun, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. A reminder that some bonds were too strong to break, and that even in the most unexpected places, love had the power to change everything. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming tales like this. Every story holds a lesson, and every moment of kindness can make a difference. Don't forget to like the video and share it with others who believe in the power of love and loyalty. See you in the next one.